how's it going? Today we are going to engage divine command theory as an approach to ethics. This is actually a very old ethical theory, and we have two selections from our selected text, Vice and Virtue in Everyday Life, one of which is Morality is Based on God's Commands by Robert C. Mortimer. Mortimer was an Anglican bishop, I think, in the 20th century. And so we're going to look at his approach to divine command theory, and then we're going to look at a response to divine command theory by John Arthur, whose title of his work is Why Morality Does Not Depend Upon Religion. So two very different authors. One is an advocate of divine command theory, and another one is a critical of divine command theory. So, divine command theory actually goes back at least to antiquity. It is old, right? The famous philosopher Plato has a dialogue called the Euthyphro, where Euthyphro is in a dialogue with Socrates, and Socrates is the wise man in a lot of Plato's dialogues. He's a real historical person, by the way. We have a death mask of Socrates, and he was the teacher of Plato. And Socrates is on his way to court because he's being tried for impiety, which is a crime against the gods. And on his way to court, he runs into Euthyphro, and he says, "Hey, Euthyphro, what's going on?" And Euthyphro says to Socrates, "I'm trying my father in a court of law for impiety." And Socrates is like, You're prosecuting your father for impiety?" And so Socrates gets into a discussion with Euthyphro, and so Socrates says, you're obviously much better informed about ethics than I am. Can you tell me what the nature of piety is? Because that's the charge, one of the charges Socrates is being arraigned on. By the way, Socrates is a martyr for philosophy. He's probably the first Western philosopher to die for philosophy, right? They charged him for crimes of impiety and corruption of the youth. But when Socrates is talking to Euthyphro, Euthyphro says, yeah, I know what piety is. It means doing the stuff that the gods like. So he defines piety, and piety means what is good. Usually what is good, when people say pious, is defined in a religious context. But not always, because in Confucianism, for example, it's frequently remarked that there's an emphasis on filial piety. And filial piety means obligations to your family, right? So you have some moral obligations to your family, which are different than, say, obligations to the general public. But Socrates gets this definition of piety from Euthyphro. What is the gods like? That is what makes actions good. But Socrates says to Euthyphro, well, which gods? Maybe I'm pleasing some gods, but making other gods angry. And so how do I know I'm pleasing the right gods? By the way, this is Homer Simpson's. Homer Simpson makes a similar argument with Marge Simpson when Homer gives up on going to church, and Marge says, "Homie, I'm worried about your soul," right? And Homer says, "Well, we go to church every week, and how do we know we even have the right God? If we're worshiping the wrong God, we're just making God madder and madder every week, right?" So, of course, polytheism is different than monotheism, and the example that we have from Mortimer, for example, he's in the Christian tradition, and one of the things that I like about his approach to ethics is he points out that in Scripture there's an infinite worth of individual dignity, right? And he remarks that humans are stupid sometimes in their conscience, or he says they're obtuse. I believe he uses that term. So even with revelation and studying the Bible, he points out that for centuries people have tolerated, in religious traditions, they've tolerated slavery, and he claims that goes against what is revealed in Scripture. So I kind of like that, because there's this emphasis on the dignity of the individual present, at least in Mortimer's version of divine command theory. John Arthur responds to divine command theory by pointing out several things, one of which is he claims it's arbitrary in a way, and he also raises questions about how we know what we claim to know. And so this is Homer Simpson's question, of course, too. How do you know you have the right God? How do you know you have the right message? The branch of philosophy that examines the scope, nature, and origins of claims to knowledge is called epistemology, right? So if someone says something is epistemologically significant, it relates to thinking about knowledge, because sometimes people think they know things and they don't actually know them, right? There's a distinction between belief and knowledge. So epistemology winds up dealing with things like the distinction between belief and knowledge, or even true belief and knowledge, because you could have a true belief, yet it might not be knowledge. But in any case, with religion, it's quite controversial, right? Because experts don't agree, and at least since Kant, most philosophers suggest that it might be difficult, if not impossible, through human reason to prove that God exists. But that's just one of the issues that Arthur brings up in response to divine command theory. He makes this point that when Socrates asks Euthyphro, do the gods like what is good because it's actually good, or is it good because the gods like it? The second position, if it's good because the gods like it, all we would have to do is figure out what the gods like, and then we know all the answers for ethics. But Socrates points out that amongst at least the ancient Greek gods, there is, it's like a soap opera where they fight and bicker with each other. So which gods are you trying to please is a normal question, especially in polytheism. Is it true because the gods love it, or do the gods love it because it's true? Or is it true because it's in the Bible? Or is it in the Bible because it's true? You could ask the same question for monotheism. Monotheism, of course, means one God, and polytheism means many gods. But the ground of Arthur's response here goes a little bit more in depth, where he says, look, if what is good because God says it's good, then God could show up and change all the good stuff and make it bad, right? And then we'd have to follow what God says. So let's suppose we are working with the idea that thou shalt not steal as a commandment, right? If God showed up and said, okay, I'm changing all the rules, now you need to start stealing. And because I'm God, divine command theory says you have to do as I say. And most people say, what? God would never say something like that, right? And Arthur says, yeah, I agree with you. Of course God wouldn't say something like that. And that's because there's something inherently bad about stealing, right? Whether God says it or not. And so notice that divine command theory, in this case, the reason something is bad is because God says so. Earlier, we looked at utilitarianism. So if you steal, or people in society wind up stealing, it might contribute to bad overall happiness for people. But for divine command theory, the reason it's bad is because God says it's bad. And Arthur's criticism of this is that it's too arbitrary, because God could flip the good and to bad and change all the good stuff to bad stuff and all the bad stuff to good stuff. And then we might be obligated to lie, cheat, steal, and kill because God says so. And he says, look, there must be something really bad about those kinds of things. And the reason they're bad is not because God says they're bad, but because they're really bad. Right? So when people say God would never say something like that, Arthur says, yeah, I agree with you. Because there is something inherently bad about those things. So he goes so far as to even say that, look, even religious people shouldn't accept divine command theory, because his criticism is that it's too arbitrary at some level. Okay, that's all we have today for divine command theory.